For this video lecture, we're going to look at Milton Friedman and his monopoly and the social responsibility of business and labor. With this, we're going to see a defense of what he would call a free market, laissez-faire capitalism, where the role of business is first and foremost to make profit, and it is not the job of society to rein in what someone can produce and how they produce it, of course, as long as it's not, killing someone or something like that. So, oftentimes, people want to say, well, business is unethical because there's competition between people, and that this leads to, eventually monopolies. Monopolies are also bad in business because monopolies end up lowering the value of goods, and they can charge whatever price for them that they might like. Well, he says competition in ordinary language means one personally trying to outdo another. So if I'm competing against someone else in tennis, I'm trying to outdo the other person I'm playing against in tennis. So it's a zero-sum game where one wins and one loses. In business, though, he says competition is impersonal. It is not about personally trying to outdo someone else, but it is instead about one individual trying to do better. And in this way, he thinks it is not accurate to refer to competition in business as this, moral or immoral personal competition between persons. Now, monopoly is where one individual or enterprise has sufficient control over a particular product or service to significantly determine the terms on which other individuals shall have access to it. So, of course, if I have a monopoly on water, I can determine, whatever price it is that I want you to pay for the water, and you're just going to have to pay it because I'm the only one that has water. So what this means is there's a limitation on, of course, voluntary exchange, because you can't have free exchanges if only one person has the good that is valuable that people desire. You need the two people that are going to exchange to have goods, of course, that are desirable for both. And typically this invokes issues of social responsibility. That is a responsibility of society, right? We might say stakeholders to come in and say, well, no, we're going to limit, the formation of monopolies because this is bad for society. And Milton Friedman is going to try and argue why that's immoral. Now, he thinks that monopoly in industry and actual business is actually far too ambiguous, that it has a plurality of meanings, and for that reason, it's very difficult to accurately determine whether one business is a monopoly or not. He says, these concepts, as used in economic theory, are ideal constructs designed to analyze particular problems rather than to describe existing situations. So one example could be Amazon. Amazon does not meet the definition of a monopoly because there are other online sellers, and yet, we can say it's a de facto monopoly in the sense that for businesses to survive, they must sell through Amazon, right? But he would say, well, yeah, but look at what you're doing, right? You are molding the concept of monopoly how you find useful to your own ends. That would be, immoral, for example, if we want to look at Kant, in the categorical imperative. So, another issue of monopoly is monopoly in labor with unions. He thinks that monopoly in labor is also overstated, that union existence is actually significant as a negative on businesses, and that therefore not only does of course union affect business owners and their ability to increase profits as much as possible, but it also negatively affects non-union workers, because it means, according to Friedman, everyone has to automatically join the union and pay dues, even if, of course, it means they get paid more money. He thinks, well, this means there's going to be less jobs. We should point out the empirical evidence actually does not support that. The empirical evidence does show that unions do positively influence unions, and that they increase the safety of the working conditions, and they increase wages. However, and this is where it gets really interesting, Friedman thinks government-supported monopoly is actually greater than private industry monopoly, that the monopoly of government to regulate businesses as the sole source of power, that is what we should focus on, and not monopoly in private industry. So we shouldn't focus so much on, let's say, Amazon or Microsoft or something like that, and instead we should focus on the monopoly that government has over the use of force, and its ability then to coerce businesses to act in whatever ways they want through regulations. Now, he thinks monopolies occur by three different ways. One, technical considerations. Sometimes it's just more efficient or economical for a single enterprise to control production and sale of a commodity. That it just might make more sense, for example, there to be one telecommunication company. That this could come because one business is just so efficient at what they do that they just outcompete all the other businesses, and what's left is just one business, and that this is for efficient reasons, and it's not necessarily bad. Another source of monopoly is direct and indirect government assistance. That this is the greatest source of monopoly, according to Friedman. That he says that the appropriate government policy then, in response to the monopoly of government, would be to indirect support by monopoly by government, to end, for example, the corporate tax, to end regulations on corporations about who they can hire, the minimum wage, for example, things like that. That is the greatest monopoly, because it determines more than anything else, he thinks, what businesses can and cannot do. The final source of monopoly is private collusion. That this is just where sometimes businesses might pay some money to acquire another business, and they use their market power to do so. That it's not necessarily because one business is more efficient economically, but instead they just have more economic power and they can buy out their competitors. And he thinks, this is not desirable, but in a free market situation, these inevitably occur, but he does not think that they're common. Now, the moral argument he makes against the idea of social responsibility of a business starts with this. He thinks that a widespread application of social responsibility requirements would destroy a free society. That if businesses had to succumb to social responsibility requirements, we couldn't have a free market system, because whatever a business owner would want to do, they would have to consult with the community, as if the community also had rights to the private property that the business owner has private control over. Something else we have to consider is that pure competition does not exist in reality, right? It only exists as an ideal type. So, of course, when we look at the world in competition, we're not going to find pure competition. He admits that, but we should strive as close as we can to have pure, laissez-faire free market capitalism. So, he argues, what this means is making money for stockholders is the only responsibility for a business. That stockholders should not take into account stakeholders, except for a stakeholder insofar as they're a stockholder. That is the chief concern of business. For Friedman, the nature of a free economy is one where there is only one social responsibility of business. It is to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. So as long as you don't cheat others, right? That the only ethics in business are just the ethics of free exchange of goods. That's it. He also has an epistemic argument against social responsibility. So he thinks it's virtually impossible for private individuals to know what their social responsibility is, that no one can have a God's eye view of all market transactions to determine what a business should and really should not be doing, because doing something else would be better for the community. That only it is through indirect pursuits of each person, right, pursuing their own self-interest that indirectly leads to the greater good. That no one has, no one is omniscient, no one knows for sure what market transactions lead to the good. Only by each person being self-interested and pursuing their own idea of the good does that lead to the greater good, because it involves people buying and selling goods and trading on equal ground, he thinks. The normalization of this idea of social good, he thinks, would actually lead to the nationalization of industries, that it would mean the government would end up owning all major businesses because, well, the government has a responsibility to society to promote the general welfare, and that would mean, well, it would have a responsibility to ultimately determine what a business does and does not do. So, if we think that a business has a social responsibility, he thinks the consequence of that is just government owning and controlling businesses. Finally, he thinks that corporations do not have a responsibility to give to charities, and that actually they shouldn't give to charities because it takes away from the use of that money to increase profit and increase productive capabilities. So the main interest, right, of a business should be the maximization of profit, and that ultimately is an indirect greater good for all. One question I think we'd have to consider is whether or not you think the policies as advocated by Friedman would indirectly create a more moral society, or would it create greater inequality? And then, of course, we would have to ask, is that greater inequality morally bad?